There are several questions listed on the form below. These should be answered after you have watched the training video. Please have a hard copy of the htks Form A so that you can reference it as we move along in the training. There are two forms, Forms A and B. Both forms can be used interchangeably as we have not found any significant difference on children's performance for either form. There are three parts of the htks task, Part 1, Part 2, and Part 3. Each part contains an introduction, practice, and testing section. For all three parts, the introduction section includes instructions for the child. The example pictured below shows the introduction section from Part 1. Now we are going to play a game. The game has two parts. First, copy what I do, touch your head. As you can see, the introduction section is very basic and allows you to establish rapport with the child while also providing instruction. The practice section gives the child a chance to practice the rules that are presented in the task. In the practice section, you should always give feedback to the child depending on how they score. More on that later. Each testing section consists of 10 items. No feedback or reminders are given during the testing section. This is an example of what a testing section looks like on your htks form. Now we will cover some general tips for administration. Before beginning the task, have the child stand in front of you. You should try standing at their level or sitting in front of them. Read the bold text out loud to the child. Text to be read aloud will be enclosed within a text box. It is very important that you read the script as it is printed. When you see text that is in all caps, you should emphasize that word. So, in this example, you would say, "Now we are going to be a little silly and do the opposite of what I say. When I say touch your head, instead of touching your head, you touch your toes." This form also includes instructions that are meant only for you. These are not to be read aloud to the child. Instructions for you are typically in italics and are not in a text box. Lastly, when you see the stick figure icon on the page, it means that you should demonstrate the movements to the child. The stick figure only appears in the introduction or practice section of each part. No movements are demonstrated in the testing section. Be sure to look for this when we watch the sample video. In the practice section, positive feedback and reminders are given to help the child learn the rules of the game. No feedback is given in the testing section. As mentioned previously, instructions for you are in italics. This is an example of the instructions indicating that you do not provide feedback during the testing portion of the task. Reminders are given in the practice section when a child gets an item wrong. Reminders are scripted. Remember, when I say to touch your head, you touch your toes, so you are doing something different from what I say. Let's try another one. The number of reminders is limited and depends on which part of the task you are on. So for Part 1, you can give up to 3 reminders, and for Parts 2 and 3, you can give up to 2. Reminders in Part 1 and Part 2 will require you to fill in the blanks based on how the child responded. After you have given the reminder, you should advance to the next item. Do not repeat the item that the child just responded to. To help keep track, there is a space on the form that you can complete to show how many reminders have been given for that practice section. Once you have reached the maximum number of reminders, you will advance through the remainder of the practice section with no additional reminders. You can, however, continue to provide positive feedback if a child gets an item correct. The continuation rule determines if a child should move from Part 1 to Part 2 or from Part 2 to Part 3. For HTKS, if a child scores 4 or more points in the testing section, he or she should continue to the next part. If the child scores less than 4 points, the task ends with you saying, "Thank you for playing this game with me today." Here is an example of what a completed testing section might look like. Can you apply the continuation rule to this testing section? In other words, would this child move on to Part 2 of the task? As you might have guessed, the answer is no. The total number of points scored is 3. Since this is less than 4, the task ends at Part 1 and you, as the assessor, say, "Thank you for playing this game with me today." To reiterate, the continuation rule for HTKS states that if a child scores less than 4 points on any of the testing sections, The task ends and the child does not move on to the next part. Now let's discuss your scoring options. A correct response is worth 2 points and is scored when a child touches the correct or opposite body part. So if in part 1, which is located on page 2 of your task, you say, touch your toes, and the child responds by touching his head, he would receive 2 points for a correct response. This is marked on your form simply by circling correct. A self-correct is any discernible motion towards an incorrect response followed by a change to the correct response. Always make sure you wait for the child to finish all movements before looking down at your copy of htks to score. Some children will change their mind, and if this happens while you are scoring, you might not see it. A self-correct is worth 1 point. An incorrect is worth 0 points and is scored when a child touches the incorrect part and does not self-correct. As you flip through the pages of the task, you notice the different rule pairings. In parts 1 and part 2, head is always paired with toes and knees is always paired with shoulders. In part 3, head is paired with knees and shoulders is paired with toes. Having a good understanding of these role pairings will help you score the task. Let's try some examples. If you say touch your head and the child touches her toes, how would you score this? This would be correct, and the child would receive 2 points for a correct response. In the practice section, what would you say if a child scored a correct? If you said give positive feedback, then you are correct. In the practice section, it is particularly important to provide positive feedback when the child gets a correct response. This helps to reinforce learning of the rule pairings. Let's try another one. If you say touch your head and the child touches her head, then her toes, how would you score this? You would score this as a self-correct and the child would receive 1 point for a self-correct. In the practice section, what would you say if a child scored a self-correct? If you said give positive feedback, then you are correct. We still give positive feedback even on a self-correct. If you say touch your head and the child touches her head, how would you score this? You would score this as an incorrect response and the child would not receive any points for the incorrect response. In the practice section, what would you say if the child scored an incorrect? If you said give a reminder, then you're correct. Remember, the reminders are scripted. Now we will watch a video of the htks administration with a child. As much as possible, you can try to follow along in your copy of the measure. Also, make sure to note the assessor's use of positive feedback, reminders, and movement demonstrations. Before we get to that, please answer a few questions below regarding what you have learned today in the online training. After finishing up, you can select the next button to watch the video.